Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. Today's lecture event is a part of the 13th Annual Kościuszko Chair Conference. This conference is sponsored by the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies and the Center for Intermarium Studies. This evening, we'll be hearing from Ms. Maria Juczewska. Ms. Juczewska is a communications specialist with a versatile international experience. Her education in linguistics, culture studies, and international affairs, combined with years of living abroad, makes her point of view unique and comprehensive. Mrs. Juczewska worked for the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies from 2014 to 2020, and she is a graduate of IWP's MA program. At present, she is working on her Ph.D. in political philosophy. Ms. Juczewska, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Welcome, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to talk to you at 13th Kościuszko Chair Conference, which we are organizing online. I sincerely hope that we will be able to meet in person next time. But today, it is my great pleasure to talk about a person which is very inspiring and a little bit mysterious, and which continues the cycle of lectures I proposed a while ago about Polish women and Polish heroes of the Second World War. My presentation is going to be devoted to Stanislawa Leszczynska, who is also known as the midwife from Auschwitz. Please listen to her fascinating story. So Stanislawa Leszczynska is a little mysterious person, also in Poland. I believe that anybody knowledgeable with the medical profession must have heard about her, but for many years, she was not widely known in Poland. Recently, there has been some interest renewed in her, and there is a documentary about her life, which was supposed to be premiered on October 8th, but unfortunately, the premiere was cancelled due to a pandemic. But certainly, the story of her life has not been widely known, even in my own country. I came across her story quite by accident, seeing an exhibition about her many years ago in one of the Warsaw churches. And I thought that this life and the amazing things that she was able to perform in Auschwitz truly deserve a mention, especially because we are trying to remember all the Polish heroes of the Second World War. For many years, I have been fascinated by the silent bravery of Polish people who suffered under German occupation, and her stories were many times forgotten and not widely circulated, also due to Poland's isolation after the Second World War, when it was divided from the Western world by the Iron Curtain. So now I am very happy to be able to talk about Stanislawa Leszczynska and why she was so unique. She was unique because when she was serving as a midwife in the Auschwitz concentration camp as one of the prisoners, she was delivering children in horrific hygienic conditions, and yet not one mother and not one child died at childbirth, which I personally see as a miracle, and to many people it still remains a mystery. But her story is much more fascinating because it's not only the 2 years that she spent in Auschwitz that were interesting and formidable, but all her life in general is a very inspiring story of devoted service to other people. So first of all, it is important to mention that she delivered more than 3,000 children for 2 years, which gives an average of three and a half child per day. And obviously, sometimes she had days when she was delivering more children and sometimes fewer, but still, it was possible for her to do it in very austere conditions. And when working, in fact, alone, because the German Lagerärzte, that is the camp's doctors, were not helping Polish and other non-German inmates, even in difficult situations. So here you can see the picture of Stanislawa as a young girl, and her story is fascinating from the very beginning, because she was born in Łódź, one of the major industrial cities of the Polish kingdom, and that was the part of partitioned Poland, which used to be a part of the Russian Empire, in 1896. And then when she was a teenager, her family decided to try to emigrate to Brazil in search of better life opportunities. And she spent 2 years in Brazil between 1908 and 1910. The result of her stay in Brazil was that she was able to speak fluent German, which she learned at school. And if we look at her life in some longer perspective, it might be seen as the beginning of her path to Auschwitz, in fact. Because of course, when you look backwards at somebody's life, you can tell that there are certain steps that will lead to this or other development in the life of those people, or it will help them in the future to build from something quite unexpected. And I think that her stay in Brazil and encounter with different cultures and with difficult conditions which require adaptation, as well as learning German, was in fact such stage or such step. From the very beginning, she is very involved in the social service, and she sees herself as an active part of the society. During the First World War, she is active in charitable institutions in Poland. And the end of her engagement in those activities coincides with the date of her marriage. She got married as a 20-year-old in 1916. So I suppose that since then she focused on her professional work as a midwife and on her married life. She decided quite early that she wanted to be a midwife. And even though she lived in Łódź, she was commuting to Warsaw to study in a prestigious school, which taught women how to become midwives. And there is one anecdote related to that period. Apparently, one of her colleagues said that the moment she graduated from the school, on her way back to the railway station, which was where she was supposed to catch the train from Warsaw to Łódź, she visited the church, which I'm showing here in the picture, and she made a vow to the Holy Virgin that she will stop practicing her profession if she loses a patient. So she was quite committed to being a good midwife, and there was a spiritual element present in her work from the very start. And this is something I would like to talk a little bit more before I proceed to the period of her life in Auschwitz, because this kind of Marian veneration and the professional life intertwined with prayer was one of the attitudes which were characteristic for at least a part of the Polish society in that era. So when trying to understand the choices and the attitudes of Polish women of that time, and also of the times of the Second World War, we need to understand the religiosity of the Polish people and how much religious inspiration there could be in their daily life and daily profession. Here, I also would like to mention that her husband was a typesetter, which is going to become very relevant later in her life, and also might be considered one of those stages that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that lead us in life in a certain direction. So she created a home which was very warm. Her children remember the home as a place where there was always laughter, singing, kindness. All her family played instruments and sang, and she in general was a very joyful person in that period of her life. Fairly quickly, she started a large family. She had 3 sons, Bronisław, named after his father, who was the oldest, and then a daughter named Sylvia, and 2 sons, Stanisław and Henryk. As you can see, she was a fashionable lady, but also a serious one, as we can see in the pictures. And she soon became well known in Łódź as a very good midwife. There are stories about how she, for instance, attended a theatrical performance later in the afternoon or even in the evening, dressed in her best outfit. And in the middle of the play, somebody interrupted it and called her name, saying that Mrs. Leszczynska is called to the bedside of a woman giving birth, and she would just collect her things and go in the middle of the night, in the middle of whatever else she was doing. From that period in her life, there also comes a short prayer which she was known to use throughout her life and career as a midwife, which would say, "Virgin Mary, come to my help, even in one shrew." Her children remember that when she was woken up in the middle of the night to go to the woman who was in the middle of giving birth, she was always a little sleepy, so she would always have troubles finding shoes. And she would accept this fact that her profession demands from her waking up in the middle of the night and many other efforts and walking long distances to her patients. And she would incorporate it in her prayer, imagining that Virgin Mary is coming just as she is coming, a little sleepy and in a hurry, and she cannot find her shoe. So that's why she would use this sentence, "Virgin Mary, come to my help, even in one shoe," as a prayer. And as you can see, this is a happy period of her life. This family looks quite happy and content in the photograph. And this period between the 2 wars was a period which by her family was remembered as a golden era of their family. And to her, it was a period in her life when she could practice her profession. She was very well qualified due to the school that she has finished in Warsaw, and she was known among the inhabitants of Łódź as a person who is very proficient at what she was doing. And then in 1939, the war broke out and Poland was partitioned between the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany. And Poland was occupied. She lived in the part under German occupation, and she would still practice her profession of the midwife. Here we can see her family. Of course, because the period in the time has changed and Poland is occupied, and the situation of the Polish people is very difficult, as you can find out from my other lectures. Everybody is very serious in this photograph, and here you can see her sons and the daughter already adult. And the moment the war broke out, she was 44. So she was no longer a young woman. She has already been halfway through her professional career, and I would say a woman in her prime, but certainly not a youngster. The curious thing about her family is that all of them got involved in the underground, in the Polish underground. Her husband and her oldest son, both named Bolesław, got involved in the National Armed Forces, which was one of the two major underground organizations fighting against the occupiers of Poland. As you know, her husband was a typesetter, and since he was working in the printing house, he was involved in the production of forged documents, which would allow the people of the National Armed Forces to be active in various fields of sabotage of the German occupiers, as well as in intelligence outside of the borders of the occupied Poland in the Third Reich, but also to help Jews. And in this task, he was cooperating with his eldest son, who was working as a tram ticket controller. And when the tram was passing by the walls of the ghetto, the oldest son was able to transfer the documents to the Jewish people with whom he cooperated inside of the ghetto. Unfortunately, this activity of an underground forging unit was traced down, and due to the betrayal of another member of the underground organization, the apartment of Stanislawa Leszczynska and her husband was defined as one of the points where the opposition activities are taking place. The story of this betrayal is also quite dramatic, because a member of the underground organization was apprehended, and his mother was apprehended. And the people who interrogated him, the Germans, said that basically either he says where the forging office is, or they will shoot his mother in front of his eyes. So he betrayed the location because he was just unable to choose between the underground organization and his own mother. So this is how the Germans found the way to the flat of Stanislawa Leszczynska and her husband on February 18th, 1943. They came into their apartment. Her husband and her oldest son were not in, but she was there with two other sons and her daughter. So the course of events on that night was quite dramatic, because her oldest son Bronisław finally came to the flat in the morning hours, and it looked as if he was going to be arrested too. But the moment he was being arrested, Stanislawa asked the Gestapo officer that he allow her son to take a sweater, and Bronisław, her son, used this moment of decreased attention of the Gestapo officer to flee. He pushed him away and managed to flee from the flat, but unfortunately, all the other people couldn't flee, and as a result, Stanislawa, with her daughter and her two sons, was arrested and taken for interrogation. This interrogation took 2 months, and she was never keen on talking what happened throughout those 2 months. She would always say that the most important thing was that she and her 4 children survived the war, and she was not really willing to talk about what happened then. All in all, that interrogation ended in her being sent to Auschwitz with her daughter, and her 2 sons sent to the camp Mauthausen-Gusen. The oldest son and the husband avoided being arrested, and they continued their underground activity throughout the Second World War. So when she came to Auschwitz, she got the number 41,335. Her daughter got the number one number higher, so 41,336. And initially, she was not working as a midwife at all. She was working physically as somebody transporting clay for the construction needs of the camp. Those of you who are interested in the fates of people who were Auschwitz concentration camp inmates know that the conditions in the camp for women, in Auschwitz-Birkenau for women, were much worse than in the Auschwitz itself, if we can introduce any sort of gradation in the conditions that one encounters in a death camp. But the conditions in which Stanislawa and her daughter found themselves were terrible. Here you can see the living quarters for women, the 3-story beds. On every bed there were 3 women sleeping. Of course, there was filth and they had no bed linen. Whoever was sick was also suffering on those beds, so they were oftentimes covered in blood and feces. And this was the reality of life for women there. Of course, the hygienic conditions were desperate, and nobody was counting on the inmates living longer than 1 or 2 months. So this is the work environment in which Stanislawa was able to find a way to work as a midwife. Luckily for her, one of the German officers in the camp, Sister Clara, fell ill, and Stanislawa used this moment to try to reach to a German doctor to inform him that she's a midwife by profession and that she can replace Sister Clara. Sister Clara in herself is an interesting person, and which is very whose life story is very characteristic for how Auschwitz concentration camp functioned and who was being picked as people who take care of the inmates. Namely, Sister Clara used to be a midwife, but she was forbidden from performing her profession for infanticide. So a person who was sentenced to go to Auschwitz as an inmate, as a German inmate, was made supervisor for all the women who were supposed to give birth in the camp, in spite of the fact that in Germany she was forbidden from performing her profession because she was just unfit for it psychologically. The other person who was helping her was Sister Fanny, who in her previous life in Germany was a streetwalker. So those two women were taking care of births in Auschwitz until Stanislawa Leszczynska arrived there. And of course, they would perform their duties in line with what the German officers in the camp expected. What was the situation of women arriving in Auschwitz when pregnant? Those women who were visibly pregnant were immediately sent for gas. So nobody was making any excuses for them. The German law would state that women who were pregnant were not supposed to be sent to concentration camps, but in practice, many women who got to the camp when pregnant but not showing the signs of pregnancy, that is in early months of the pregnancy, were there in the camp and somebody had to take care of it. So oftentimes those women who were only in the initial stages of their pregnancy, when in the camp, they were sent to work, and when it was transpiring that they are pregnant, well, they just continued their work until they were ready to give birth. And a place was organized for them in a women's block to give birth. And of course, it was as primitive and as unhygienic as only we can imagine. And here in the bottom photograph, you can see the long construction of bricks. This was a stove that was supposed to provide some heating to the barracks in winter. In practice, rarely ever anything burned there. So the barracks were so cold that there were icicles on the rooftop inside of the room. But this was the only place which could serve as a bed on which you can give birth. So this is what Stanislawa used for all the deliveries that were taking place there. In her memories, she mentions that the blanket that she used as something to cover this stove with was so filthy that she could see lice marching on it to and fro. But this was all she could provide the women with. As her instruments, she was able to use a pair of rusty manicure scissors and a container for warm water. To get water, she would have to walk 20 minutes with a metal bucket, and she would have to bring this water on her own. Of course, there was some sort of curfew. After in certain hours, you were not allowed to leave the barrack, and you were risking your life to bring the water. So there were many elements of the daily routine in the concentration camp, which would make her work even more difficult. But coming back to Sister Clara and Sister Fanny, before May 1943, the official regulation of the camp would state that every child that is born in the camp needs to be exterminated. And when Stanislawa came to work as a midwife, she was told that it doesn't really matter if she cuts the umbilical cord or not for the children. She is allowed to throw them away just as they are, without even taking care of the umbilical cord. So she was supposed to just get rid of the child and throw it away into the cold with the placenta still attached. But the general rule was that all the children were supposed to be killed after birth. And before she came to work as a midwife, before May 1943, all the children were killed, and Sister Clara and Sister Fanny would just drown them in a bucket or in a barrel that they kept in their own small quarters. So the mothers that would give birth could, right after the birth, hear the gargling sound of their child being drowned, and then the body of the child was thrown out of the barrack for the rats to eat it. So this is the extent of the horror that women had to go through. But when Stanislawa Leszczynska came to Auschwitz, everything changed. And first of all, we need to realize that when she went and volunteered to become the midwife, there was already risk involved in that, because she was not able to predict what the behavior of the German Lagerarzt, that is the camp doctor, is going to be. Theoretically, if he was not in a good mood, he could react by shooting her for just approaching him and talking to him when not asked. But she spoke fluent German, and luckily for her, she was able to somehow take with her to the camp the certificate that she is a midwife. And the accounts of different people differ in this regard. Some say that she was able to smuggle it with in a box of tooth powder, the substance used for cleaning teeth, that she had on her in her handbag. Some say that she just had a handbag on her when arrested, and that the certificate was there because she would use it with as a proof that she really is a midwife, which her work card, the Ken card, was saying. This was an obligatory document that you had to have on you all the time when walking in the streets of the occupied zones of Poland, in case somebody decided to double check your identity. So she had to have the proof of her being a midwife on her all the time, also because she would oftentimes need to work at night, and she would walk in the streets during curfew. So she had to somehow show that she is allowed to do that by virtue of her profession. So it's not clear to me after my research how she managed to have her certificate on her, but she did. And this is something which made it easier for her to identify herself as a midwife to the camp's doctors. And when she substituted for Sister Clara, it turned out that she is so proficient as a midwife that it just stayed like this. The German officials in the camp decided that since Sister Clara is not allowed to perform her duties as a midwife officially, because she was sentenced for infanticide, they will just stick to the midwife that is one of the inmates. And this is how things began changing, because Stanislawa Leszczynska refused to kill the children. Of course, Clara and Fanny would take the children later and dispose of them, but at birth, nothing would happen to the children. The children would be, Stanislawa would see to that the birth process is completed uninterrupted. She would give full possible care to the mother and full possible care to the child. She would cut the umbilical cord. She would take care of the children. And after May 1943, there was a new regulation introduced by the Germans that the non-Jewish children are allowed to live as long as they manage to live. Some of them, the blue-eyed ones, and the blue-eyed, blonde-haired children would be taken away from their mothers to Nakło, where there was a special office formed for the Germanization of those Aryan-looking children. So some of the children would avoid the terrible fate of being in the concentration camp by virtue of their Aryan looks. The other children would be left with their mothers to die, and the Jewish children would still be taken away and drowned in the barrel of water by Sister Clara and Sister Fanny. I already spoke a little bit about the hygienic conditions and human dignity in those barracks. As you can see, this was terribly cold, terribly unhygienic, terribly dirty, infested with lice and other vermin. Many women were very sick as well, because the disease were rampant in the camp. But even so, Stanislawa would sometimes manage to use those conditions to the benefit of mothers and children. Namely, if a child, if a non-Jewish child died because of the disease or hunger or cold, she would try to substitute a Jewish child for it. So if she managed to do it when Sister Clara and Sister Fanny were not looking, but usually they were, but sometimes there were some circumstances that would allow for the switch of the child, she would do that. Of course, as a Christian practitioner and Christian believer, she would baptize all the children that were born, and she would make she would go to every length to create conditions in which the children can live. What was the situation of women who were expecting children in Auschwitz? Of course, they had to work hard. Of course, they were famished. So most of them didn't have any breast milk when they were giving birth. So they were unable to feed their children, and many children were just dying of hunger and cold. It was impossible for them to get any children clothing, so often a woman who would be expecting birth would save away her portions of bread to exchange them for some sheet, a bed linen sheet, from which she would prepare diapers and some clothing for the newborn. One of the horrific memories of Stanislawa Leszczynska that she mentions in a report that she first published or said publicly in 1957 is this memory of mothers who are unable to feed their children and their breasts are dry, so the children are trying to suck in search of food and they cannot find it, so they cry. And the only way to soothe their children was to sing lullabies to them. Stanislawa also remembered that women would the women who gave birth would draw strength, would derive strength from the fact of motherhood, the very fact of having given birth and having your child with you was a ray of hope to them. So they would cling to this experience even when their children were dying, or even when there was a decision that this or other child will be taken for Germanization. This was another difficult experience, which Stanislawa was trying to make a little easier for women. Namely, whenever this situation would happen, that there was a chance for the child to survive due to the fact that it was Aryan looking, she would really encourage mothers to part with their child. But she devised a way to make a small tattoo in a place which would not be visible at the first sight to the German officers taking the child away, so that the identification in the future is possible. So the mothers who were forced to part with their children, they could at least cherish hope that if they survive, they will find the child because it has a tattoo that only they know about, and that it can be identified afterwards through the tattoo. Some of the documents I read mentioned the armpit as the place of the tattoo, but again, I believe that the documentary that will soon be available in Poland will be able to possibly explain this in more detail. One interesting thing about Stanislawa Leszczynska was that when she was refusing to kill the children, and when she was insisting on performing all the activities involved in the child delivery in a correct way, she would use a very clever argument that she will not be instrumental in breaking the Hippocrates oath that the doctor has taken. So she would, when talking to the German doctors, she would say that she, as a midwife, is not going to help them in any way to break their oath. So she is obliged to save the children by virtue of the medical oath that the German doctors had given when starting their professional path as doctors. So I figured that this was a very clever way of justifying why she was not doing what they expected her to do, especially appealing to the mindset of that day in Germany, which would respect orders and official regulations and take them very seriously. So she would soon became known among the inmates as an angel. They would refer to her angel, or they would refer to her Mutti, which means mommy in German, and because she would go to such length to help every woman giving birth that they would appreciate at least that ray of hope and human dignity in all that terrible situation. Some of them remember that when there was no painkillers and the labor would get very painful and very prolonged, she would sing to women giving birth, or she would comb their hair and braid their hair just to make it in some way easier for the woman in that terrible situation. And here we are entering the realm of immortal, the realm of immortal mysteries, because even even though the conditions in the death camp were desperate, even though the health conditions of women were terrible, not one of the women that Stanislawa Leszczynska took care of, not one child that she delivered died at birth. There was no case of a hemorrhage, no case of any infection that would lead to a death of any mother that gave birth in Auschwitz. And in her report, she described a situation in which one of the camp doctors asked her to report on the number of mothers' deaths, children's deaths at birth, the number of of complications after birth and their types. And when she said that not one of her patients died, the doctor couldn't believe. He exclaimed that even the best German clinics don't have such results, and she delivering in filth and without any medical provisions is able to get this fabulous result. How can that be? So how can that be? Just a little bit of statistics for to end this story. For 2 years that Stanislawa Leszczynska spent in Auschwitz, she has delivered more than 3,000 children. Approximately 1,500 were killed after birth by Sister Clara and Sister Fanny by drowning. More than 1,000 died of hunger and cold. Approximately 500 were sent for Germanization, and 30 survived. Out of those 30, 17 later on contacted, later on in their lives when they were already adult, contacted Stanislawa Leszczynska and were able to thank her in person for saving their lives. What was happening after the war was also characteristic of Stanislawa Leszczynska. First of all, she worked in Auschwitz for 9 days after everybody ran away from the camp. The Germans marched everybody out of the camp before it was overtaken by the Red Army. But Stanislawa and one more and a doctor who was with her, a female doctor who was with her, refused to go. They stayed to help the women whose labor was beginning or who were to give birth soon. And they remained in the camp until it was liberated on January 27th, 1945. After a brief stay in Krakow for all the people who used to be concentration camps, the concentration camp inmates, she came back to Łódź, to her hometown. What I also would like to mention here was that throughout her stay in Auschwitz, she was there with her daughter Sylvia. Her daughter was helping her as much as she could, but not being a midwife, she was obliged to perform other kinds of work and was oftentimes sick. Twice there was a situation that her daughter was selected for gas, and twice Stanislawa Leszczynska hugged her so tight that nobody was able to separate them, and she said she would not let her daughter go alone and that she will go with her. And both times the officials in the camp were so determined to keep Stanislawa working as a midwife, and they needed her so badly that they said, okay, your daughter is staying, she's not going to be gassed. So Stanislawa was not only brave in her performance of her everyday duties, she was also a very devoted mother and a person ready to risk her own life to save her daughter's life. And this is what happened. Her daughter survived the camp and she came back to Łódź with her mother. Later on, two of the sons came back from concentration camps, as well as the son who managed to escape from the initial arrest. The only person who didn't survive the war was Stanislawa's husband, and he, after his family was arrested, he was active in the underground, and during the Warsaw Uprising, which was the largest insurrection against the Germans during the Second World War, about which you may find out from other Kościuszko chair lectures, he was killed when defending Warsaw. So Stanislawa comes back to Łódź only to find out that her domestic happiness is no longer going to come back. Her beloved husband died and she has to start her life anew, but she would always focus on her children, and she would always emphasize that it was a miracle that all of her children came back. And she believed that all her children came back because she was very dutiful when performing her work as a midwife. And she would say that she took every care of every child that she was delivering in the concentration camp. And this is why her children came back, because she was always faithful to her vocation, and she was always saving lives. After the war, her health condition was much worsened, and so was the condition of her daughter. But nevertheless, Stanislawa would work as a midwife for another 13 years. She stopped practicing midwifery in 1958. And after she stopped doing this, she focused on helping her daughter raise her children, because her daughter would always remain fragile after her concentration camp experiences. What is also important here is the attitude that Stanislawa took after Auschwitz. She wouldn't really talk about her experiences at all. Many of the younger members of her family didn't even realize what an ordeal it was. They knew she was in the camp, but she would never delve into details, and because it was not interesting to the afterward generation, they weren't asking. And what Stanislawa was always emphasizing was that one should focus on the human side of the matters there. She would always emphasize that she was trying to think about everyone as a human being, as a person. And this included also the German supervisors of the camp, who were responsible for all the suffering of all the people there. What made her talk about her wartime experiences was, in fact, one of her sons. All of them lived to become doctors, and two of them became doctors. One of them became an artist and an architect. And one of her sons persuaded her to talk about her experiences in Auschwitz, especially because he was finding the fact that none of the women and none of the children that she was taking care of died at birth. He found this fact extraordinary. So she wrote a brief report, which can be found on a website related to the Polish to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, and the link to the report will be provided with this video so that everyone can read for themselves the English version of the report. She also published a book about her experiences when she was retired. She used her time to write it. The book is entitled No, One Must Never Kill Children, and it is a longer version of her brief report from 1957, and in which she expands on certain ideas from the report and on certain memories. Here, I would also like to talk a little bit about the fate of the children, because Stanislawa was especially fond of children, and the reason why she was working as a midwife was because she loved children, and every time she would recollect in her memory the events and moments she spent in Auschwitz, she would say that whenever a child was born, she felt as if she was present at God's birth. So to her, her work as a midwife and her service to women in labor was also a spiritual experience. So I think it is important to understand who she was, because it's so amazing that in her this spiritual aspect of her work and her professionalism intertwine and become a motivation in the situation in which it is really hard to get motivated. And also she was able to find joy in delivering children, even though she knew that that their life is not going to be long, that they will probably die from hunger and the conditions in which they came to life. But nevertheless, the fact of birth and the child in her arms would be immense source of awe, never ending source of joy. And I think this is where we touch the secret of the secret of her life attitude, like her firm pro-life stance, is because she was able to understand the miracle of life, because she witnessed the miracle of life in the most extreme negative conditions, and she was able to fight for the miracle of life in those conditions. So I think it is very inspiring to even try to imagine ourselves in that situation, and how she tackled the task might be something which makes us think about the real motivation for work, but also the real motivation for keeping to be human and keeping to be good. Here, I would also like to read a brief excerpt from her report, which she found extraordinary and one of the most dramatic stories that she witnessed. Because I just want to give you a feel of the document and maybe encourage you to read it on your own. So this is the story of the woman of Vilno. Out of all the tragedies I saw there is one I remember most vividly, the story of a woman from Vilno sent to Auschwitz for aiding resistance fighters. As soon as she had given birth, her number was called. When prisoners were summoned to report, they were called by their prison numbers. I went to excuse her, but that didn't help. It only infuriated the SS staff. I realized that she was going to be sent to the crematorium. She wrapped her baby in a dirty sheet of paper and pressed it to her bosom. Her lips moved in silence. Perhaps she was trying to sing a lullaby for her baby, as mothers often did to make up for the cold, hunger, and torments their babies had to suffer. De Villiers had no strength left to sing. Only tears came from under her eyelids and fell on the condemned baby's head. It's hard to tell what was the most tragic. The simultaneous death of these two beings who were so dear to each other, or the mother's agony on watching the death of her child, or her dying before the baby and leaving it to its own fate. So these are the dilemmas that women in Auschwitz faced daily, and the dilemma that Stanislawa Leszczynska witnessed all over again for the 2 years that she spent in Auschwitz as a midwife, and still was able to perform her work with all the dedication and strength and support for women, which resulted in them calling her mommy. At present, the beatification process of Stanislawa Leszczynska is ongoing. So far, she has been announced as servant of God in 1992, and the process is hopefully going to find a conclusion in beatification or canonization. Of course, for it to be finished, we need miracles. So we need somebody to be healed or miraculously saved from the threat of death when praying to her. So this is like a Catholic thing, important for all the people who are Catholic. But it is important to mention here that that she has been recognized by the Catholic Church in Poland as one of important women who were witnesses to Catholic faith. Her person can be seen here. She has been portrayed on a votive chalice that has been offered by Polish women in the most important Polish sanctuary of the Fair Mountain when 600th anniversary of the sanctuary was being celebrated, and a special chalice was offered for the purpose of performing a mass. And 4 women important for the Polish history were portrayed on it: Saint Hedwig of Silesia, Saint Hedwig d'Anjou, Blessed Maria Teresa Laduchowska, and Stanislawa Leszczynska, who is portrayed hugging a naked child in her prison garb. So this is a portrait from her work in Auschwitz, obviously, and the child is naked because it symbolizes her work as a midwife. What I also found interesting when getting to the point where she was universally, when she died, considered universally as a saint, because this is one of the notions that may be an argument for opening the beatification process, is that when she was dying of cancer in 1974, she refused to take pain medications, offering her suffering for the as a repentance of sins for other sinners. So of course not everybody is Catholic, and not everybody understands the intricacies of the Catholic faith. But for those who are Catholic, this is just one more proof that she lived the gospel, and that her life was a life of devotion, devotion to God and to Virgin Mary through work and through prayer. So hopefully Stanislawa Leszczynska will still be an important person to people who are practicing medical profession in Poland. I hope she will also serve as an inspiration to everyone who is looking for motivation for their professional work. I personally find her a formidable woman and a formidable human being. Reading the report was an important experience for me, because even though the report is very brief, through its sober and short form, I could see how perceptive and how sensitive to the needs of other people this woman was. But at the same time, she was no drama queen at all. Her way of reporting is very succinct and very informative, even though you can see that she was passionate about what she was doing. So I think it is important to talk about Polish women heroes of the Second World War. I think it is very important to understand that being a hero doesn't really require any battlefield. And sometimes just remaining humane and remaining just is all we need. So to finish my lecture, I hope that you will read the report. And as the very last conclusion, I would like to read the excerpts of the report that describe the children born in Auschwitz concentration camp, and the inspiration that was and the inspiration that they were for Stanislawa Leszczynska, that propelled her through her professional life and allowed her to survive the most horrific ordeal and become a point of reference, a help, and a mother, not only to her own daughter, but also to all the women whom she was helping, and in a way also to their children whom she delivered. Thank you. So here are the words. I am describing them as Mommy's last words, but they are not last words, the ones that she uttered at the end of her life, but the ones that she finishes the report with. Among all these ghastly memories, there is one thought that lingers in my mind. All the babies were born alive. They all wanted to live. Contrary to all expectations, and in spite of the extremely inauspicious conditions, all the babies born in the concentration camp were born alive, delightful, and plump. Nature defied hatred and extermination, and stubbornly fought for her rights, drawing on an unknown reserve of vitality. So far, I have not had an opportunity to deliver a midwife's report from Auschwitz. I am presenting my account on behalf of the mothers and children, those who could not tell the world about the wrong done them. Thank you.